Good day. Today is Saturday, 28th December 2024. We are now almost at the end of the year, and we have had a most extraordinary article in the New York Times, in my opinion, one of the most interesting that has been published by the New York Times ever since Russia began the special military operation back in February 2022. Because this article in the New York Times, which in my opinion is clearly sourced from within the Biden administration, is not only an admission of failure, an extraordinary admission of failure in Ukraine, but it is also the first move by the Biden administration, by top officials within the Biden administration, to construct alibis, excuses for the terrible misjudgments they have made over the course of the war and the debacle that is about to happen. Now, I say that, of course, the article is not penned in that way. In fact, if you go to the title of the article, it's extremely bland. Ukraine slows firing of missiles into Russia as Trump prepares to take office. In fact, as I pointed out some weeks ago, after a flurry of missile strikes in November, there seemed to be a sudden cessation of missile strikes after a conversation between General Gerasimov and General Brown, the respective heads of the Russian and American militaries. There was a period of about 2 weeks when missile strikes essentially stopped. Then another missile strike on Rostov, on Taganrog and on Rostov seems to have taken place. That led to further Russian responses, but since then we've seen no further missile strikes whatsoever. Now, this article in the New York Times purports to explain the reason for this. I don't think that the reason it is giving is the true reason. But what I will say straight away is that it provides a huge amount of information, or at least a certain amount of information, which is very interesting and which tells us a great deal about the sort of decisions that the United States, the Biden administration to be more precise, was making over the course of the conflict. Anyway, the first thing to say is that the article begins with a long discussion about the decision to authorize missile strikes inside Russia, something that the United States had repeatedly refused to do, something which the Pentagon quite publicly opposed. It talks about how the Russians have not escalated in quite the way that some had feared, though it rather grudgingly acknowledges that the primary reason why the Russians have chosen not to escalate is because Donald Trump is due to become president on the 20th of January. He has made known his view that the decision to authorize military strikes against Russia was a serious mistake. He's made it clear that he vehemently opposes that decision. So the Russians have every incentive, rather than escalate the situation to dangerous levels, to wait until Trump becomes president, see whether he will follow through on what he says. And of course, if the missile strikes on Russia then end, the Russians will be able to say to themselves that their warnings have been heeded, that the deterrent effect of their warnings has worked, and that there is no reason, therefore, for them to escalate the situation in dangerous ways, given that the problem has now been resolved. That is one thing this article says. The article also makes all sorts of claims about the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows claiming that they've been effective in the course of the conflict, though providing minimal details in respect of this. But here begins the first astonishing admission. The United States had long resisted sending Ukraine long-range ATACMS with a range of 190 miles, fearing that their use deep inside nuclear-armed Russia would escalate the war. In the spring, President Biden relented. Now notice this, because of course this changes the date completely. It turns out, if this article is true, if what the article says is true, that the Biden administration took the decision to authorize use of ATACMS missiles to strike targets in Russia, not in November, as we were all led to suppose, but actually in the spring of this year. Now, that is much earlier than anybody supposed. And one has to ask, why the delay then in launching missile strikes against Russia? Well, I'm going to suggest that the reason is not difficult to gauge. The reason was extremely strong opposition to this decision by the Pentagon. It looks as if the argument that raged within the United States government about this matter was much, much fiercer than any of us outsiders had imagined. The president and his officials made the decision way back in the spring to start this enormous process of escalation then, but the Pentagon only finally withdrew its opposition as late as November. Now, there's a number of interesting facts to say about this, because of course back in the spring, this is the moment when the military situation in Ukraine began to deteriorate. Avdiivka, the fortress town just north of Donetsk city, used by the Ukrainians to shell Donetsk city, an absolute key element in Ukraine's fortified defense lines in Donbass, and the possible spring point for an offensive that the Ukrainians might have eventually planned to launch in order to recapture Donetsk city itself. Anyway, in February of this year, Avdiivka fell, and there was intense fighting. After that, the Russians continued their advance, much to the surprise and shock of many people, and the Russian advance continued, and sometime around March, the important strategic village of Ocheretino fell. And then, over the course of the next few weeks, as I remember, throughout March and April, rumours circulated about a major Russian offensive in Kharkiv region. There were fears expressed about a possible Russian advance on the city of Kharkiv itself, even though President Putin made it clear many times that Kharkiv was not a Russian objective, at least not at that time, and that the Russians were seeking to establish a buffer zone to protect the city of Belgorod from repeated attacks by the Ukrainians, and indeed Belgorod region itself. And this is a logical point to decide that a decision to launch missile strikes against Russia would be made. And it looks as if this was a time when I remember the British and the French were openly talking about launching missile strikes against Russia. David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, was strongly advocating this, leading to a major dressing down of the British ambassador to Russia by the Russian Foreign Ministry. It looks as if the debate that was taking place then in April and May about authorizing missile strikes against Russian territory. When I say Russian territory, I mean Russian territory within the borders of pre-2014 Russia. It looks as if the Biden administration, contrary to the information that was circulating at around that time, this was when they made the decision to authorize missile strikes inside the territory of pre-2014 Russia. But the Pentagon strongly objected, and initially they only authorized the launch of HIMARS rockets. That was the public decision. But we now can see from this article in the New York Times that the actual decision to press forward with missile strikes using ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles against Russia, that decision was made way back in May, probably May, April, around that time this year, much earlier than people assumed. This is another example of the Biden administration saying one thing and actually doing something completely different, of the Biden administration telling everybody that it had decided not to make an escalatory move, one that the Russians had strongly warned against, when in fact it had privately already decided to make that decision. And just to add, it also explains some of the things that happened afterwards. Throughout the summer, there was a drumbeat of complaints from the Ukrainians, from the British, from the French, about the fact that the ATACMS missiles, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, were not being used in terms of strikes against Russian territory. There was a visit by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to Washington in September, in which he requested permission to launch Storm Shadow missiles into Russia. Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, had told Keir Starmer that the decision to allow launch of the Storm Shadows into Russia would be made then. And that, of course, is completely understandable now, given that the president and his inner core of officials had already signalled their intention to agree to this way back in May. But again, the objections from the Pentagon were just too strong, and in September the decision was put off. I'm going to suggest that the reason the Pentagon decided to reverse its stance in November is very simple. President Biden was no longer a candidate in the US presidential election. His successor, Kamala Harris, as successor as nominee for the Democratic Party, was defeated on the 5th of November by Donald Trump. Donald Trump was expected to oppose this decision. The Pentagon is always uncomfortable resisting the orders of the man who is the commander-in-chief, who is, of course, the president, and so they decided to allow the decision to launch the missile strikes on Russia to take its course, and that is why missile strikes took place in November, using the purported presence of the North Koreans as the cover story. This was, of course, a story spun by the Biden administration and the Ukrainians, stretching all the way back to the summer. And one can understand better now the context in which that story was spun and the final decision was made. So that is one enormously interesting revelation. The decision to authorize the missile strikes into Russia was made in the spring. It was communicated, it must have been communicated at that time to the Ukrainians, the British and the French. The Pentagon clearly objected, and that was why it was put back until November, after Donald Trump, who was going to reverse the decision, took office. So that is one enormously important revelation. Squirreled in to this article, we now have more revelations as well. The administration shipped as many as 500 missiles from Pentagon stockpiles, the US officials said. While Ukraine couldn't use them in Russia, they fired them at targets in eastern Ukraine, controlled by Russia, and in Crimea, seized by Russia in 2014, aiming at hardened command and control posts, weapons, storage areas, and some other bunkers. Now, the article appears to conflate the decision to authorize missile strikes on pre-2014 Russia with this decision to supply the ATACMS missiles. There's an attempt here to smudge the chronology. In fact, the decision to supply the ATACMS missiles was made in the autumn of last year, in the autumn of 2023. The first ATACMS missiles, from my own recollection, and I'd have to check the date now, but my own recollection is that the first ATACMS were used, I think, either in November or December last year, specifically in a strike on an airfield, I believe in Berdyansk, in Zaporozhye region, where a number of Russian helicopter gunships were hit as a result of this first attack. And many more strikes followed over the course of the winter and the spring, and the use of ATACMS missiles thereafter became essentially a routine affair. And of course, Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles were being used by Ukraine for many months before this. Now, this is one of the most astonishing revelations of all. As many as 500 missiles. They're not identified, the missiles in question, but these are clearly ATACMS missiles. As many as 500 missiles from Pentagon stockpiles were shipped to Ukraine. 500! Now, we've not had information about how many ATACMS missiles were supplied by the Biden administration to Ukraine over the course of this conflict. But now we have the number, 500. This was a huge delivery of ATACMS missiles, starting from the autumn of 2023 and being conducted thereafter. We are talking about hundreds of ATACMS missiles, many more, to be frank, than I had myself appreciated. Now, this is where it all becomes interesting, because Wikipedia, and I think this is almost certainly correct information, says that the total number of ATACMS missiles produced by the United States since production began in 1991 comes to 3,700 missiles. Wikipedia also says, and by the way, I believe this is true, that production of ATACMS missiles ceased in 2007. I believe this is correct. I believe that there's been attempts to fudge this question, but I believe that no all new ATACMS missiles have been produced since 2007. ATACMS missiles have been refurbished to some extent. They've been modernized. The production of ATACMS ceased in 2007 after 3,700 had been produced. Now, again, according to various reports that I have seen, before the start of the Ukraine war, something like 500 ATACMS missiles had been used in action in various wars around the world. The United States has exported a significant number of these missiles to various clients, countries, allies of the United States around the world also. There's been quite an important export of the US military-industrial complex, just saying. So that begs the question of how big the stockpile of US ATACMS missiles was on the eve of the start of the special military operation. And bear in mind that since production stopped in 2007, that must mean that all ATACMS missiles delivered to Ukraine must have come from the existing US or perhaps NATO stockpile. Now, I don't know the exact figure for the US military's stockpile of ATACMS missiles. I noticed that Wikipedia isn't providing it, and I've done a quick search around and I can't find it. But to the best of my recollection, when I looked into this question around a year ago, and I may be completely wrong here, but I seem to remember that the stockpile then was being reported as being around 2,000 missiles, which, given the fact that some missiles had been used in action, other missiles had been exported, it doesn't seem to me an unreasonable estimate. If I'm wrong about this, please correct me. But if I'm right, 2,000 missiles in the stockpile, the United States, the Biden administration, has given Ukraine around a quarter of the US military stockpile of ATACMS missiles. Now, I might be completely wrong here, but even if I am, even if the stockpile is significantly bigger than I think, or think it was, well, 500 missiles out of the stockpile will have significantly reduced the stockpile, given that we are talking about a stockpile that is not being added to because the production of ATACMS missiles ended in 2007. And about that, by the way, the last point, I am confident that this is true. And this stockpile, this vast delivery of hundreds of ATACMS missiles, heavily depleting the US military's own stockpile of these missiles, this vast delivery of 500 missiles has achieved nothing. We read, and this is again from the New York Times, US and NATO officials said those strikes had been effective. What's the evidence of this? I see no sign of it. But also said that they felt Ukraine could have been more judicious in the number of missiles used and more selective with targeting. That sentence is an incredible act of mendacity. It is an unbelievably mendacious statement. Because Vladimir Putin, the Russian officials, and this has been never disputed by any official in the West, in the United States, in Europe. In fact, it's been confirmed by all sorts of people. In fact, it's even been confirmed in various articles. Vladimir Putin has said that Ukraine cannot itself prepare ATACMS missiles for launch. The launching of these missiles requires US military personnel to become involved, because only they can process and prepare these missiles using the necessary targeting data. And that is why these missiles, launching these missiles into pre-2014 Russia, is seen by the Russians as so extremely provocative and as crossing a red line. So, when the Ukrainians are blamed for overuse of these missiles, for not using the missiles against suitable targets, the reality is that the Americans must have been involved, given all of the other information that we have in picking the targets. It couldn't have been. It couldn't have happened otherwise. It's their satellite and other data that's used to identify the targets. It's their technicians who prepare the missiles. Taken together, they launch the missiles. And now, of course, that the missiles have failed, well, blame the Ukrainians. They used too many of them. And what we read is that what has happened with the ATACMS is the story of what has happened with other Western weaponry in Ukraine. This goes back to the New York Times. Ukraine pressed for months or even years to get Western weapons, HIMARS rocket launchers, Abrams tanks, and F-16 fighters. But by the time the West granted access to these weapons, Ukraine had lost more ground. And no weapon has been a silver bullet. Western officials also say Ukraine has relied too much on help from the West and hasn't done enough to bolster its own war effort, especially in mobilizing enough soldiers. So, we provided you with all these weapons. We're a bit slow sometimes in giving you the weapons, but in the end we gave you all that you asked for. We gave you Abrams tanks, about which, by the way, there's now significant criticism about how they performed in Ukrainian territory. You can find videos about this on YouTube. They're very interesting, some of them are, about how heavy the Abrams has turned out to be, how ill-adapted to the geography and the climate it has turned out to be, what an easy target it has proved to be for the Russians. There's been lots of criticism of the Abrams, and by extension, by the way, of the Challenger 2s and of the Leopard 2s. Only Hamish de Bretton Gordon in the Daily Telegraph continues to claim that the Challenger 2s have been a prodigious success. Everybody else can see that the Western tanks have failed in Ukraine. The F-16s have achieved nothing so far, and that whole story is increasingly looking like a debacle. But we see that the ATACMS, and by the way, by extension, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, have been a failure as well. They've not been a silver bullet, and the Ukraine has relied too much on help from the West. Again, this is an astonishing, incredibly dishonest statement, because the only reason Ukraine went to war with Russia at all, The only reason Ukraine maneuvered towards, pressed to join NATO, the only reason Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk agreement, the only reason Ukraine walked away from the Istanbul agreement is because the West urged it to, or the West encouraged it to. At the time when Ukraine first applied to join NATO, made an application to join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008, the big majority of Ukrainians opposed NATO entry. But they were encouraged to pursue it. They were told to make it, to enshrine it in their constitution. There was endless agitation and pressure from Western leaders to do that. When the Minsk agreement was signed, after the Maidan events, which of course the West also supported, when the Minsk agreement was signed, the Ukrainians said they decided that they weren't going to implement it, and they were encouraged not to implement it by the Western powers, by the Americans and the British overtly, as we now know, by the Germans and the French covertly. And of course, the worst of all, after the Istanbul Agreement was agreed in April 2022, the Western powers told Ukraine to walk away. They were told, and this is hardly controversial, that if the Istanbul Agreement was signed, if Ukraine went ahead with it, the United States and Britain would refuse to extend to Ukraine security guarantees. And at the same time, they were told that they could continue the war with the Russians and they would get all the help, all the assistance they needed, all the weapons that they needed. The Russians were weak, much weaker than anybody had expected, and they would be provided with all the weapons that were needed, and, well, that would be enough to stop the Russians and to push them back and to engineer the regime, provoke the regime change in Moscow. And of course, the sanctions were also expected to succeed. And if we go back to 2022, after the Kharkiv offensive, the only really successful offensive that Ukraine has ever launched over the course of this war, and a massively costly offensive in terms of men and material. It was as well, by the way. But anyway, after the Kharkiv offensive, it was the West, again, that pressed Ukraine to launch its utterly disastrous summer 2023 offensive, that supplied them with all those Abrams tanks and Leopard 2 tanks and Challenger 2 tanks, which we're now told were not a silver bullet, with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the only armoured vehicle apparently that the Ukrainians rate at all amongst the many armoured vehicles that the West has supplied them. Anyway, it was the West again that basically urged the Ukrainians to launch this offensive that ended catastrophically for them. And after the failure of the 2023 offensive, according to the Ukrainian media, and no one in Britain is denying this, the British urged the Ukrainians to go back on the attack again and urged them to launch the operation in Krinky, to conduct an amphibious operation across the Dnieper, this in the autumn, as the weather conditions were getting worse. And we now have told by the Ukrainians that the intended purpose of this operation was not just to establish some tiny bridgehead in some isolated village on the east bank of the Dnieper, but to press forward and to conduct a kind of replay of Normandy and to advance all the way to Crimea itself. Anyway, we're now told that it's the Ukrainians' fault, that they haven't actually mobilized enough troops, that they've relied too much on Western weapons that weren't a silver bullet. I have to say, if I was a Ukrainian reading this, I would choke. I would find this one of the most infuriating things. Now, I'm not somebody who feels any sympathy whatsoever with Zelensky and his officials. I did once, by the way, when he was elected. I thought his election was a good thing, and I liked all the things he was saying at that time. For a very long time, I felt sorry for him. But over time, speaking entirely for myself, all that has, well, it's long since evaporated away. But reading a comment like this, it almost makes me feel sorry for him again. Going back to that famous phrase of Professor Mearsheimer's about how Ukraine was led along the primrose path to its own destruction. Well, here we see the very people who led it along that primrose path, people of the Biden administration, the neocons, all of those people, and they're telling us, well, we did what we could, we gave Ukraine all the weapons, but ultimately it was their fault because they didn't do enough to bolster their own war effort, especially by mobilizing enough soldiers. Anyway, what about the effectiveness of the ATACMS? Well, we're told that it has been, the weapons were successful, though the evidence that this is so is incredibly thin. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I don't think it has been any sort of success at all. I think it has been an absolute debacle. 500 missiles, the only tactical ballistic missiles that the United States currently has in service. There is a replacement which is under development. Development has been incredibly protracted. No doubt at some point it will appear. But at the moment, the ATACMS is the only tactical ballistic missile that the United States military has in its arsenal. 500 of these precious missiles have been sent to Ukraine, and broadly speaking, they have achieved nothing. Now, here again, it's perhaps worth going back in time and reading what the various advocates, and I'm not going to name them, but it's not difficult to find them. Many of them decorated senior officers of the US and British militaries. Anyway, it's worthwhile going back and reminding ourselves of all of the things they claimed that the ATACMS, and by the way, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps would achieve. Closing the Crimean ports, destroying the Crimean bridge, destroying other bridges leading into Crimea, isolating Crimea, driving the Russians out of the Black Sea, defeating the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. How many claims to that effect have been made? How many times has the odd destruction of a Russian warship, a corvette here, a patrol boat there, a auxiliary supply vessel, how many times has that been claimed to have defeated the Russian Navy in the Black Sea? That the Ukrainians have won the battle of the Black Sea. Well, the Russian Navy is still there. It's still launching missiles at Ukraine from the Black Sea. It seems to be, in fact, if anything, over the last few months, expanding its area of control. Russian fifth-generation Sukhoi 57 fighter jets are apparently patrolling the Black Sea. And as for the isolating Crimea and doing any of those things, well, none of that has happened. I always remember Brian Boletic's brilliant taking apart of all of this story when there was one particular supposedly successful strike on some facility in some Crimean port He pointed out that the sheer number of missiles, the extraordinary degree of preparation, the hard work that had to be done in order to conduct this one successful strike, which did, as I remember, only a limited amount of damage, effectively refuted the entire premise that the ports in Crimea could be closed off permanently by missile strikes, by mass missile strikes. So here we have the point, because 500 missiles, a supply of so many missiles, what can it have been for other than to support operations against Crimea? This is the decision to supply the missiles, the ATACMS missiles, made, as I said, in the autumn of 2023, around the same time as the British were urging the Ukrainians forward to mount their operation in Krinky. I remember that there was a meeting between General Zaluzhny and General Milley, the American, the then chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral Radakin, the head of the British military, who I've always suspected was one of the most fervid supporters of the Krinky operation. And the Ukrainians have never named him, but I still think that is likely true. Anyway, it seems to me that clearly what happened at that time was that this decision was then made to urge the Ukrainians to conduct this operation. The 4 Marine brigades redeployed from the Vremenevka salient, where they'd been apparently taught to fight, and they've been redeployed to Kherson region, and they launched this operation, and the decision was made to supply the ATACMS missiles in order to support the operation in Krinky, with the plan being to conduct this blockade of Crimea and to prevent the Russians re-equipping and reinforcing their army defending on the east bank of the Dnieper. And that was why 500 of these missiles were supplied. It was not done as some kind of demonstration strike or anything of that kind. It was clearly done in order to support a military campaign. And the only campaign that makes sense was the attempt to renew the disastrous summer 2023 offensive by a new offensive across the river into eastern Kherson region, advancing to Berdyansk and ultimately to Crimea itself, supported by multiple effective strikes with the ATACMS missiles. Except that the ATACMS failed. The Russian air defense system was too strong. The Ukrainians were unable to break through. They were quickly bottled up in Krinky, and the whole operation, as the Ukrainian media has confirmed, and as many Ukrainian soldiers who have participated in it have also bitterly described, that whole operation was a complete disaster. So there it is. We see the whole story of the ATACMS, and I'm going to suggest that it's the whole story of the West's involvement in the entire debacle, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Trump, obviously, is now being in part set up as the scapegoat for all of this. He's going to end the supply of weapons, the flow of weapons and money to Ukraine. He's putting the whole project Ukraine in doubt. But ultimately, the people who are being blamed are the Ukrainians. They didn't use the ATACMS properly, even though they can't use the ATACMS without our, that is to say, America's and the Storm Shadows without our, which is to say the British, and in the case of the scalps, the French's help. But it's their fault. They relied on us too much. They should have mobilized earlier, and they need to mobilize further now. On that front, by the way, it looks as if Zelensky, despite all his brave words, is now reversing course. He just about 2 weeks ago, articles were appearing in the Daily Telegraph saying that his relations with the Biden administration had all but collapsed because he wasn't agreeing to conscript boys down to the age of 18 into the Ukrainian army. Well, now it turns out that a bill has been presented to the Ukrainian parliament, which is indeed going to authorize conscription of boys right down to the age of 18. So presumably there's been some kind of big payoff. There's reports of more Western weapons and more funding. The United States supposedly is going to rush another delivery of $1.7 billion of weapons to Ukraine over the next couple of weeks while the Biden administration is still in office. There are other reports of further money being sent to Ukraine. Presumably, all of that is enough to persuade Zelensky to reverse course, to U-turn, and to agree to do or that very thing which he repeatedly promised the Ukrainian people he would never do, which is bring the conscription age down to 18 so that teenagers can now be recruited and thrown into the meat grinder to buy a few more weeks with their lives. Well, there we are. So, this, as I said, is the preparation, an article preparing us for the debacle which is to come. It's not the fault of the president and his officials, it's a fault of other people. The Pentagon for slowing down the decision made in the spring to launch the missiles against Russia. We're told that the final authorization, by the way, was made on the 17th of November, when, of course, the North Koreans were brought into the war, where there's even some of the old stories repeating themselves. US officials said the weapons would initially be used mainly against Russian and North Korean troops in the Kursk region of Western Russia, but of course at that point it turns out otherwise. Taganrog, which is one area where the strike has taken place, is not anywhere close to Kursk region, and there are no claims that there are any North Koreans there. The Ukrainians are still trotting out claims that they've captured lots of North Koreans, but all of them apparently have died of their wounds. So there's no physical proof still that any North Koreans are actually fighting in Kursk. We only have the Ukrainian claims and the American claims that they are there. But anyway, put all that aside. We've had the article itself admit that it was in the spring that Biden relented, that the authorization was done to launch the strikes on Russian territory. And, well, here we are. Here we are, and nothing has been achieved. And we are then told that it is indeed the case that by the time the decision was made to authorize the missile strikes on Russian territory, most of the missiles had already been used up. 500 missiles were delivered, depleting heavily the US's stockpile by mid-November, when the decision was made to conduct the strikes against Russia. Only 50 or so were left. And it seems the Storm Shadow and Scalp stockpiles have also been hugely depleted. I understand that France started with a stockpile of around 600 scalps. the British had a stockpile of between 800 and 1,000 Storm Shadows. Large numbers of these have now been supplied to Ukraine. They too have been expended, and they have achieved nothing. Stockpiles of valuable missiles launched against the most advanced, best organized, and most efficient air defense system in the world, and they have achieved nothing. Well, there's an awful lot more one could say about this debacle, but perhaps I've said enough. We're going to get many more articles of this sort as the war grinds towards its now inevitable conclusion. But there it is. An astonishing admission in veiled language from the New York Times, obviously, as I said, originating from within the administration. The blame game is already underway, and we can see how some people who've made all these dreadful decisions are trying to pass on responsibility. Now, let me return to one other topic, since I've spent an awful lot of time talking about missiles and missile strikes and those kind of things. Let me now return briefly to the topic of the Oresnik missile. Now, I was recently contacted by a very interesting and informative source. I call him a source. He actually published a piece in open source on Slavyangrad, in which he also discussed the warhead of the Oresnik missile. And he is also of the view that the warhead almost certainly does use a kind of metallic explosive. Let me stress, this is not my own area of expertise, but he points out, or rather he suggests, that the explosive, the warheads of the Oresnik are not made of iron or steel or that kind of metal, that they largely consist of a metallic explosive mix of I presume principally tungsten and aluminium. And like my other source, he says that this person has said that the explosive effect of this, well, I'm going to call it a compound. I'm probably not using that word correctly in chemical terms, for which apologies to everybody, but there it is. Anyway, the explosive effect of this compound would be several times greater than a similar charge using conventional high explosives. I assume that in order for this explosive to work, it has to hit the ground surface at extremely fast speeds. In other words, the rounds are inert until they strike the ground. Though, again, I may be completely wrong about this, and if so, again, apologies. And, well, that would make a great deal of sense. It would reconcile the things that Putin and Lukashenko, by the way, are continuing to say about the Oresnik with the things that Professor Postol has been saying. Professor Postol and some others have been saying. Professor Postol assumes completely inert rounds made of some metallic substance, possibly iron. These others, the source who's getting the information from Russia. The person who's discussed this in this article, this piece that he wrote in Slavyangrad. And by the way, he makes it clear, this person makes it clear that this is based on his own calculations, assumptions. They're talking about a different type of warhead. It's still metallic, but it is made of a metal compound made up of tungsten and aluminium, which explodes on this massive scale on impact. And going back to what my original source said, the point is that the speed that these projectiles move means that they will penetrate through the roof of any artificial structure until they hit the ground soil, at which point they will explode with the force that I've just discussed, and causing the effect that Putin said, turning the ground to kind of liquid condition, affecting massive devastation. And that would probably explain why we're not getting reliable information about the damage done to the Yuzhmash factory. Now, if all of this is correct, and again, I want to stress, I'm now talking well outside my own areas of expertise. If all of this is indeed correct, then we go back to the original thing I said about the Oresnik, that we are talking about the most powerful conventional weapon in existence. And apparently the German intelligence agencies have assessed it, and they've advised Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, who apparently commissioned this report, that it is indeed an utterly devastating weapon, and that the Western powers have no defense, no reliable defense against it. So there we are. Perhaps I would quickly say that when I criticise the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, I'm not saying that these are intrinsically bad weapons. It is just that they are now out of date. They're old. Development of the ATACMS apparently began in around 1980. The Storm Shadows and the Scalps are an evolutionary development of a missile developed in France, also in the 1980s. They use what are now outdated technologies, whereas they're up against a Russian air defense system that is vastly more advanced, uses much more advanced technologies than the ones that they have. The Oresnik, by contrast, uses modern, up-to-date technologies, and that is what makes the difference. Now, since I've been talking a lot about air defense and things of this kind, I'm going to briefly, very briefly, touch on the air crash in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh president has just given warning that we should all wait for the results of the investigation. He says all sorts of stories and rumors are flying around. A lot of this is misinformation and should not be taken seriously. We need to wait for the final explanations and results. I think that is the wisest and most proper thing to do. Now, I know an awful lot of people are speculating, and when I say speculating, British and American governments have been openly speculating that these missiles that this aircraft was damaged, was basically shot down by Russian air defenses as it was flying towards the Chechen capital, the airport at Grozny. I am sure. I think that this is a plausible explanation. if I was to guess, I would say that it is the most likely one. But let's please wait to get the final report, and then we can draw more clear conclusions from this. What I will say about this, the other thing I will say about this is that the report, the claims that we are having are all based on photographs and all kinds of things of that kind, of parts of the airframe. By now, I've become so cynical about photographs that I'm not prepared to jump to conclusions. If this aircraft was damaged in that kind of way, if that was the reason that the aircraft crashed, well, so be it. The Russians shot it down, and they must take responsibility for the fact. But let's wait and see. I would quickly add that if, as I suspect many people expect, we get a completely untransparent, opaque report which doesn't provide a real explanation of the crash, which is, in other words, a cover-up, I, for one, have little doubt that I will be able to see that for myself, that I'll have little difficulty distinguishing and establishing that. I've read many reports, post-accident reports in my time. I can always tell when somebody is being evasive and is trying to conceal the truth. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. Let's now turn quickly to the military situation in Ukraine, which goes from, well, disastrous from Ukraine to catastrophic. Now, this morning, according to multiple reports, the Ukrainians have now published pictures of drone attacks on Russian soldiers fighting on the territory of the thermal power plant west of Kurakhovo. So it looks as if the Russians are in the process of storming the thermal power plant in Kurakhovo. There's also reports that the Russians have cut all the roads leading to the thermal power plant, and that they have complete air control over the over the village of Dachny, somewhat to the west. So it looks as if the Ukrainian troops in the thermal power plant are cut off from resupply. They're being attacked by the Russians. They have no secure line of retreat. The Russians control all the roads. They will have to do what their comrades in Avdiivka, in Ugledar did. They will have to retreat across the fields in midwinter under the observation of Russian drones, Russian FPV drones, flying over the skies constantly, and of course the Russians on the ground as well, hunting them as they retreat. It is going to be a grisly affair, a shocking business. It could be over by the new year. I don't think the Russians work to any particular timetable, but it is going to be a horrible business, and it means that the entire Kurakhovo bridgehead, as it's called now by the Ukrainians, in other words, Kurakhovo itself, about to fall. The Ukrainian forces located to the south, such as they are south of Kurakhovo and slightly to the west of Kurakhovo, likely to be forced into retreat as well. I've seen some claims that around 580 square kilometers of territory are, following the fall of Kurakhovo, about to pass under Russian control. Might be true. Anyway, that's one disaster that's looming. The Russians have now begun drone strikes and bombing strikes on Velikaya Novosilka. All the main roads into the town have been cut as well by the Russian military. It is highly likely, in my opinion, that the Russians will soon begin an attack on Velikaya Novosilka. I cannot imagine that this small town can be defended by the Ukrainians for very long. It is a small place, 5,000 to 6,000 population before the start of the conflict. There remains, again, a possible route for the Ukrainian soldiers still in Velikaya Novosilka to retreat. There is a small gap in the Russian circle around the town, but it's important to say that it's quite narrow, and again it would mean a retreat across country roads and open fields in midwinter, probably at night, under the observation of the Russian drones, which by the way now have thermal imagery so they can see at night, they can see movement at night, and with the Russian artillery and all of that operating as well. Another grisly operation, though probably not as horrible as the one that awaits the Ukrainian defenders of the thermal power plant in Kurakhovo. The military summary channel said that they had 6 kilometers across country to retreat through before they reach safe ground. I really do wonder how many of them will survive the attempt. Anyway, a looming disaster there. Further, elsewhere on the Ukrainian battlefronts, I've not really had much understanding of what has been going on around Kupiansk, right at the other end of the Ukrainian contact line. But it's now clear that the Russians have established a significant bridgehead north of Kupiansk on the Oskol River, and that they're on the brink of capturing a village, a small town called Dvorichne. Now the point is that with the capture of Dvorichne, the Russian bridgehead will become significantly large, and it will become possible for the Russians to transport armored vehicles across the Oskol River. And if the Russians are able to do that, then, well, I think it's game over for the Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk, a little to the south. The Russians control significant territory around Kupiansk on the eastern bank of the Oskol. If they're on the north bank of the Oskol, then, as I said, it is a disaster for the Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk, and they will probably have to retreat from Kupiansk itself. And who knows, maybe at that point the road to ETHEREUM and other places, important places, could open up as well. And further elsewhere as well, our old friend Andrei Marochko now says that the Russians control around half of Terny village on the Zherebets River. The Russians have also crossed the Zherebets River elsewhere and have apparently captured a small village west of the Zherebets River. And they seem to be gradually improving their positions around Liman as well. And there are some reports that they've captured a place called Zarichne, which presumably is also close to to Liman, though I might be getting my geography completely wrong. There are so many places of similar names that I don't always follow it. There are also reports of further Russian advances in Toretsk. Apparently there's less than a kilometer left before the Russians reach the northern boundary of Toretsk. The Russians gradually pushing through Toretsk. The Ukrainians have made a major effort to try to defend Chasiv Yar. This has been the longest battle, by the way, of the Ukrainian war, by which I mean the Battle of Bakhmut. the Russians began the Battle of Bakhmut in earnest in the autumn of 2022. They captured Bakhmut itself in May 2023, clearing the villages west of Bakhmut took a fair amount of time, however. Eventually, they reached Chasiv Yar itself. Chasiv Yar is treated by the Russians as part of the Bakhmut area. The Battle of Bakhmut will finally end once Chasiv Yar is under Ukrainian control, under Russian control. The Ukrainians seem to have made a major effort to try to defend Bakhmut, to try to defend Chasiv Yar. They've sent reinforcements there, constant stream of reinforcements. They're still clinging on to parts of Chasiv Yar, but the Russians are steadily pushing them out. And I'm going to make a guess here that over the next couple of weeks, once the situation elsewhere in the south, around Pokrovsk and Kurakhovo, and to the north around Kupiansk and in Kursk region, once all of that is resolved, we're going to see a major Russian operation in this area. The main focus of the Russians will shift to this area around Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk. The Russians will make concerted moves to complete the battles for these three places and advance on the last major remaining conurbation within Donbass, still under Ukrainian control, the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, which once the Russians control all of these places, and also Volchansk to the north, will be effectively undefendable as well. Anyway, let's press on now to the biggest, most important battle, or rather the most dangerous situation for the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians continue to gain ground south of Pokrovsk itself, but they are not for the moment giving any sign of intending to launch an immediate attack on Pokrovsk. Redovka did suggest in an article it published yesterday that a Russian attack on Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, might be coming fairly soon. But the Russians are holding their positions, or maybe improving their position slightly south of Pokrovsk. The major battle, or rather the major Russian advance, is not happening in the Pokrovsk area. It has come entirely unexpectedly in a completely different place, which is southwest of Pokrovsk. And the Russian advance here is so rapid. There are now reports that the Russians have reached the village of Novoyelizavetivka, west of Selidovo, and that they've captured another small town called Ukrainka in this area, and that the Russians are advancing so fast in this area that I can only assume that there is limited Ukrainian opposition, that the Ukrainian army is now so overstretched and so overextended that it simply doesn't have troops and reserves to hold back the Russians in this area. And that explains why the Russians appear to be taking village after village. Some reports say more than one a day in this area. They are able to advance, apparently without any resistance. The major place that they may be heading towards is a place called Novopavlivka, which is, I believe, a small town. What exactly they intend to do, whether they intend to go on advancing westwards until they reach the Dnieper well, I think that's unlikely, or whether they intend to veer north to cut the roads into Pokrovsk from the west. They apparently already have air control over these roads. Well, again, all of that, we're going to have to wait and see. I'm not going to try to guess. But I think the pace of the Russian advance in this area to the southwest of Pokrovsk is the fastest I've seen at any point since the first weeks of the special military operation. I don't think I have seen the Russians move as quickly as they are moving in this area. And that, as I said, makes me think that there is little Ukrainian opposition to speak of here. And last but not least, an article in Bloomberg has appeared which says that the Ukrainians will be pushed out of Kursk region at some point within the next few months. It's guesstimated it might be around 2 months before the Ukrainians are finally driven out of Kursk region. I think that's highly likely. Probably might even be sooner than that. And Military Summary Channel said that the Ukrainian forces, the combined Ukrainian force in Kursk region and in Sumy region resisting the Russians in this area has now fallen to 24,000 from peak strength of 55,000 at the height of the summer, the height of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk region in the summer. And this, if you believe Putin, after the Ukrainians have lost more heavy equipment in Kursk region than they lost in the whole of 2023. Again, to repeat, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has been a disaster. The narrative that some people make that Western military supplies have arrived too little, too late, is a misrepresentation as to what has actually happened. The United States, the Western powers, have supplied Ukraine with as many weapons as they thought Ukraine needed at any particular point in time in order to hold back or defeat the Russians. I remember reading an article back in the summer of 2022, I think it was in the New York Times, sourced from senior US officials, saying that the United States was confident that it could supply Ukraine with all the weapons it needed in order to hold the Russians back. The point is that the United States and NATO have consistently underestimated Russian military capabilities. Again, I remember reading another article about a year ago about the dismay in the White House that the Russians seem to have almost unending resources in terms of men and machines and equipment that they could throw into the battle. And it was this failure to assess Russian strength properly that explains the disaster that is playing out now in Ukraine. Now, that has to inform the negotiations, which I am certain, like the Russians are, like everybody I think now is, are going to begin once the new president is inaugurated on the 20th of January. It needs to be said again that any calculation, any assessment of the future of these negotiations that does not take into account the fact that the Russians have, to all intents and purposes, won the war, that Ukraine has perhaps only a few months of resistance left. Any such assessment is going to profoundly misjudge the situation and will lead to the Western powers, to the United States, entering the new negotiations, believing that it has a stronger hand than the one it actually does. If people in the new White House, in the new administration, really want to understand what has happened in Ukraine, what has gone wrong in the war, they can do no better than read this latest article in the New York Times, which I have discussed today. Read it with the same critical eye, which I have done. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to go to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.